March 12, 1940. Near Kharkov, midnight. Snow sweeps sideways across the proving ground like a living thing, hissing, slashing, swallowing the world in white. A single pair of headlights, dim, yellow, trembling, cuts through the blizzard. Beneath them, the shadow of a tank lumbers forward, metal groaning, engine coughing against the cold. And beside it, a man is running through the storm, running beside his own creation. Mikhail Koshkin's boots punch into knee-deep snow, every breath a cloud of fire in his lungs. His fur-lined coat is soaked through. Ice clings to his scarf, but he refuses to stop. He keeps pace with the prototype tank, his tank, because he knows every pair of eyes from Moscow is watching. A tank designer is not supposed to run alongside a machine weighing nearly 30 tons, but tonight is not about supposed to. The prototype designation, a 34, pushes forward, snow piling against its sloped armor like a white tide. Inside, the crew can barely see him. Only the faint silhouette of their chief designer, illuminated by their headlamps, stumbling, recovering, pointing, shouting over the storm. Faster, don't let it bog down. You can almost feel how wrong this scene should be. Engineers build tanks. They do not test them with their own bodies, but Koshkin had no choice. Back in Moscow, the bureaucrats had laughed at him. Sloped armor. Absurd. Diesel engines. Too experimental. Wide tracks. Waste of steel. A tank that could move fast, hit hard, and ignore the snow. Impossible nonsense. Yet here it is, alive, roaring, plowing through a blizzard that had crippled half the Red Army's existing armor during the Winter War. The 34 does not sink into the drifts like the old BTs. It glides across them. The wide tracks spread the weight like a snowshoe. The diesel engine growls confidently. The armor, angled like a sharpened axe blade, sheds ice and wind with ease. Koshkin stumbles, catches himself, then slaps the glacis plate with his bare hand. A crewman yells from the hatch, "Comrade engineer, you'll freeze, get inside." But he shakes his head and keeps running. This moment is more than a test. It is a challenge, a message, a dare to anyone who still doubts him. A gust hits like a hammer. The wind howls. Visibility drops to nothing. For a few seconds, the prototype vanishes into the whiteout. Koshkin stops, panting, searching desperately for his machine through the swirling dark. Then a low, thunderous rumble. The tank bursts through the snow curtain like an animal breaking from a trap. Steam pours from its exhaust, treads churning, armor glistening with ice. It moves with a kind of brutal grace, primitive yet unstoppable. And for the first time tonight, Koshkin smiles. He raises a trembling hand and signals the crew to halt. The prototype grinds to a stop, engine purring. As the blizzard eases for a moment, he presses his forehead against the cold armor. This machine, this ridiculous idea, has survived everything the storm threw at it. But he knows something else, something darker, something urgent. He will have to convince Stalin next. Convince a man who does not tolerate failure. Convince him that this strange, sloped, diesel-fed beast could save the Soviet Union from a danger few are yet willing to imagine. Snow lashes him again. He wipes his face. He looks at the tank, and he whispers, "They will fear you." He has no idea just how right he will be. Because far to the west, in a place not yet on fire, German tank commanders are preparing for an invasion, believing Soviet armor to be outdated, soft, laughably inferior. They have no concept of the storm that is being forged this very night. Morning breaks over Kharkov in a pale, metallic glow, the kind of light that makes steel look colder and men look older. The storm has passed, but the proving ground is a wasteland of churned snow, ice ridges, and the deep scars of tank tracks. And yet, there sits the 34, steam curling from its engine deck, snow melting off its sloped armor like candle wax. A silent challenge to every skeptic who said this design could never work. Inside the factory headquarters, the temperature is not much warmer. A long corridor smells of coal smoke, oily rags, and the stale breath of cigarette-filled arguments. Designers, officers, and party functionaries crowd around a table covered in blueprints. All eyes turn as Koshkin enters, still red from the cold, boots dripping onto the concrete floor. Chief Engineer Alexander Morozov, his close partner in this gamble, leans over the drawings with a worried frown. "You're late," he murmurs. Koshkin just nods. His voice is raw from shouting in the storm. Across the table, a political officer taps a pencil, unimpressed. "So, Comrade Koshkin," he says, flipping through the papers without reading them. "Your sloped armor, your wide tracks, your diesel engine." The way he says diesel engine makes it sound like treason. "It worked," Koshkin replies simply. The room goes still. "Worked. Through that storm? Impossible." Koshkin spreads photographs across the table. Grainy black and white shots of the tank plowing through snow, cresting drifts, shrugging off ice. The skeptics lean in despite themselves. Wide tracks mean no bogging down. The diesel engine means no engine fires. Sloped armor, his greatest obsession, means incoming rounds won't strike at a perfect angle. They will ricochet, they will fail. And failure is not something the Red Army can afford. Still, a colonel in a heavy wool coat scoffs. Armor is armor, engineer. Sloping it does not make it stronger. It only makes the tank uglier. A few bureaucrats chuckle. Koshkin stares at him with a look so cold it could have frozen the Volga. Ricochets, he says quietly. One word, the colonel blinks. What? Ricochets, Koshkin repeats, sliding a metal plate onto the table. It's angled, dented, scored, but not pierced. We fired a 45 round at close range. And, the engineer leans forward, it slid off like rain. A silence falls over the room. Morozov suppresses a grin. But even this proof isn't enough for everyone. One official adjusts his glasses, unimpressed. Maybe so, but we have orders from higher up. Moscow wants fast tanks, not armored tractors. Your design is too heavy, too radical, he hesitates. Too strange. Koshkin feels a surge of heat rise in his chest. Strange. He had heard that word before. Every innovator in the Soviet Union had. He forces his anger back down. We don't need another BT-7, he says. Need something that can survive. Another officer shrugs. Survival is not the priority. Speed is. Koshkin slams a rolled blueprint onto the table so hard the inkwells jump. Speed does not matter if the tank dies in the first 10 minutes, he shouts. Men exchange uneasy glances. This is dangerous territory. Engineers do not raise their voices to political officers, not if they want to keep their careers or their freedom or anything else, but Koshkin presses on. Give me the factory. Give me the steel, give me the men, and I will give you a tank that can break the enemy's teeth on day one of the next war. The political officer looks at him, expression unreadable. You speak as if war is imminent. Koshkin exhales, his breath still fogging in the cold air. It is. The room falls silent again. Snow drifts lazily past the frost-covered windows, but inside everyone suddenly feels the weight of what's coming. After a long pause, the officer gathers the photographs, taps them into a neat stack, and stands. Moscow will need to see this for themselves, he says. Prepare your prototype, you will take it west. Koshkin's heart skips. A demonstration run across hundreds of kilometers in winter across some of the worst roads in the USSR. If the tank fails, the design dies. If the design dies, his career does, and perhaps much more than that. But if it succeeds, everything changes. He nods. We'll leave within the week. Morozov grips his shoulder as they walk out. This could make history, he whispers. Koshkin's jaw tightens. History is coming whether we're ready or not. He looks back through the window at the 34 steaming in the cold light, and he knows the truth. The next test won't be a blizzard. It will be the Soviet Union itself. The wind hammered across the snow-packed Karelian isthmus, slicing sideways like a blade. Dawn hadn't even broken yet, just a bruised blue glow on the horizon, the kind that makes every shape look sharper, colder, more dangerous. And somewhere inside that pre-dawn silence, an engine coughed to life. Not a gasoline engine, a diesel one, something no other tank in the world was using at the time. Koshkin stood on the frozen ground, collar pulled tight against the -30 wind, watching as his prototype, A-32, soon to evolve into the T-34, shuddered, growled, and finally settled into a steady, confident rumble. Steam hissed around the hull. Snow trembled beneath the wide tracks. Engineers gathered in a huddle, stamping their boots, breath fogging in front of them. Someone muttered, "It won't make it to the next village, never mind Leningrad." Another replied, "Then we're all unemployed tomorrow." But Koshkin wasn't listening. He was already climbing onto the hull. He didn't have to. He was the chief designer. This was his brainchild. He could have stood back and let his technicians take the risk. Instead, he gripped the frozen handholds and hauled himself into the commander's position. "Let's go," he ordered. The driver gunned the throttle. The diesel engine snarled, the tracks bit into the icy ground, and the tank lunged forward, straight into the deep winter forests of the Finnish front. This wasn't just a test run. This was an act of defiance. For months, bureaucrats in Moscow had mocked the wide tracks. Too heavy, too complicated, too unconventional, the sloped armor, a childish fantasy. The diesel engine, unnecessary and untested. And now the man who designed it all was taking his creation on a cross-country winter march that could easily kill him. Or worse, embarrass him. Snowdrifts taller than a man clogged the forest paths. Frozen lakes cracked like artillery shells under the weight of the tank. Branches whipped against the hull. At times, the wind was so harsh the driver couldn't see more than a few meters ahead. But the 32 just kept going. You can almost feel the vibration in your chest, the steady churn of metal and fuel, the rhythmic bite of tracks slamming through ice. There were moments where the tank tilted so far you'd swear it would roll. Moments where the snow swallowed the lower hull, turning the world into a blinding white storm. And yet each time the wide tracks clawed back up, hauling the tank onto solid ground. Hours passed. Villages came and went, small clusters of wooden houses half buried in snow, smoke curling from chimneys. Locals watched silently as the strange new machine thundered by, shaking the earth beneath their boots. Inside, the crew was freezing. Diesel engines ran cooler than gasoline ones. The interior felt like a refrigerated coffin. Frost formed on the walls. The radio operator rubbed his hands together until the skin cracked. But no one dared complain, not with Koshkin sitting above them, eyes sharp, jaw set, determined to prove every critic wrong by sheer force of will. Then came the worst moment, a steep, icy hill half concealed by blowing snow. The driver hesitated. "No tank makes it up that," he warned. "This one does," Koshkin replied. The driver downshifted. The tank roared, surged forward, dug in, then slid back. Again. On the fourth attempt, something changed. The wide tracks found grip. The slope surrendered. The 32 climbed. When it reached the top, the crew erupted into cheers, not loud ones, more like exhausted, disbelieving laughter. Koshkin didn't join in. He simply stared out over the endless white expanse ahead of them, almost daring the terrain to fight back again. But the snow wasn't done. A storm rolled in, fast, vicious, sudden. The world became a swirling blur. The driver navigated blind through a blizzard so thick the tank's own shadow vanished. It was the kind of weather that grounded aircraft and stalled infantry columns. The 32 pushed through it like a furious animal. By the time they reached Leningrad, the crew stumbled out half frozen, eyes bloodshot, clothing stiff with ice. Engineers waiting at the depot stared at the tank in disbelief, its hull coated in frost, its tracks packed with icy mud, its engine still rumbling defiantly. Koshkin climbed down last, boots crunching on the snow, and for the first time in days he allowed himself a thin, exhausted smile. He had proven it. Sloped armor, diesel power, wide tracks. The ridiculous idea had survived the kind of trial no paperwork committee could ever imagine. But he had paid a price. The winter march had shredded his lungs. He was coughing blood before the day was over. The cold had sunk deep, deeper than anyone realized. And while the tank would go on to become a legend, Koshkin would not live long enough to see it roll into battle. Still, his prototype had reached Leningrad. And the next stop was the proving grounds where everything would change. Something was waiting there, something that would confirm whether his tank was merely impressive or revolutionary. The blizzard hit so suddenly it swallowed the world. One moment the prototype tank crawled through a frozen ravine outside Kharkov. The next, it was pushing into a wall of white so thick the horizon simply vanished. Snow hammered against the armor plate with a hollow, metallic hiss, and the wind cut sideways across the step like a knife. Inside the driver's seat, senior mechanic Alexei Kalevad gripped the controls until his knuckles went pale. The cold seeped through every seam in the hull. His breath fogged the dim interior as the tank lurched, groaned, and surged forward again. Diesel smoke curled through the ventilation ports, hot and oily, mixing with the smell of metal and winter. Behind him, standing hunched in the turret basket, Mikhail Koshkin braced himself with both hands. He wasn't coughing yet, not badly, not like he would be later. Right now, he almost looked proud, a faint grin crossing his face each time the tank climbed another drift without breaking rhythm. Because this wasn't just a test. This was a fight for the tank's survival. The bureaucrats back in Moscow expected failure. They wanted proof, physical, undeniable proof, that Koshkin's ridiculous sloped armor design was impractical, that the wide tracks would jam, that the new diesel engine would choke in the cold. So Koshkin decided to give them the opposite, a 1,800-kilometer winter march, through the worst blizzards in a generation, straight to Moscow to park the prototype on their doorstep. The tracks churned, flinging arcs of snow behind them. Kalevad could feel the difference every second. The tank didn't sink like the old models. The wide tracks distributed the weight, almost gliding over the frozen earth. The sloped armor shed snow the same way it would shed incoming rounds, cleanly, effortlessly. Behind them, engineers in fur-lined coats trudged through the drifts, watching, shouting notes, waving flags to guide the lumbering machine through the storm. Their cheeks were raw, their boots stiff with ice, but none of them complained. Because this wasn't just Koshkin's idea anymore. It was their fight, their machine, their statement to the future. Hours later, they stopped to check the gearbox. Steam rose in thick clouds as the engine hatch cracked open. Tools clinked in the dark. Someone shouted over the wind, "It's running hot but steady." Koshkin wiped melted snow from his eyebrows, leaning close to hear. The noise of the engine drowned everything else out, a deep mechanical heartbeat pounding through the hull. He knew what that meant. The diesel engine wasn't freezing. It wasn't stalling. It wasn't failing. It was proving them all wrong. But as the march continued, the storm worsened and Koshkin began coughing more. A dry, rasping choke that he tried to hide each time the crew looked his way. He ignored it. Every time he planted a boot in the snow to climb out and check something himself, he winced but kept moving. You can almost feel the cold tightening around his lungs. You can almost hear the strain in every breath. But without him pushing, the tank would never make it. And he knew it. By the time they reached the edge of Moscow days later, the prototype was coated in a shell of ice, but its engine still thundered like a war drum. Steam poured from its exhaust as it rumbled across the frozen streets, workers turning to stare in disbelief. The tank looked alien, sleek, angular, defiant against the winter. It was everything the old Soviet tanks were not. And as the prototype rolled into the courtyard of the Kremlin Design Committee, snow melting off its armor in long, thin rivulets, one truth became impossible to ignore. Koshkin's ridiculous idea had survived the winter. Now it would have to survive the one place even harsher, the Soviet political machine. In the days that followed the failed bureaucratic ambush, the design hall at factory number 183 changed. Something in the air hardened. The workers didn't whisper anymore when party officials walked by. They just nodded, tightened their jawlines, and returned to their benches. Every clang of a hammer, every grinding spark from a welding torch seemed to say the same thing. We finished this tank. No matter what. Under the high rafters, the prototype's hull sat like a half-completed beast, its sloped silhouette already unmistakable. Sheets of rolled steel leaned against the walls, chalk markings scrawled across them like battlefield plans. Prints littered tables. Some were stained with tea, some with grease. A few with blood small cuts workers didn't bother stopping for. Koshkin walked the floor slowly, one hand trailing across the cold metal plating. He wasn't smiling anymore. His breaths were shallow, as if each step cost him something. But his eyes were burning brighter than ever. "You see," he whispered to his chief draftsman, not breaking stride. "A tank is a living thing. If it protects its crew, it's worth every risk." The men around him didn't respond. They didn't need to. They simply worked faster. Across the factory, the diesel engine team was locked in its own private war. The V2 power plant was unlike anything Soviet tank bureaus had attempted at this scale. Aluminum alloy, high compression. More efficient, more complex than the crude gasoline engines the Red Army preferred for simplicity. Sparks showered over a mechanic's shoulders as he leaned deep into a half-finished block, shouting to be heard. "If this thing doesn't freeze in a Russian winter, I'll eat my cap." His partner laughed but didn't look up from the fuel injector he was calibrating. "Better start chewing." But there was fear, too silent and unspoken. What if the party inspectors returned? What if the design office was shut down? What if all of this noise, this sweat, this fight, was erased by one signature in Moscow? Every engineer had seen what happened when projects displeased the wrong man, and they knew Koshkin was walking a knife's edge. Late one night, long after most workers had gone home, Koshkin climbed onto the hull and sat in the driver's seat, still just a cold steel shell. His breath fogged the air. Snow drifted through the open factory doors. He placed both hands on the controls as if the machine were already alive. "You will change everything," he murmured to no one. From the shadows, his deputy Morozov approached, holding a stack of fresh schematics. "You should rest," Morozov said. Koshkin didn't move. "If I rest, Stalin wins." Morozov sat beside him on the hull, letting the silence stretch. The two men listened to the echoing creaks of the giant building settling in the cold. Then Morozov said quietly, "Tomorrow we start testing the final drive. If it fails..." "It won't." Koshkin cut him off. His voice had no doubt in it. "None. You sound certain." Koshkin finally turned to him. "If this tank fails, Morozov, the next war will be lost before it begins." A gust of icy wind swept across the empty floor. It rattled the metal shutters and carried with it the faint smell of coming snow. Outside, the temperature was dropping fast, the kind of cold that cracked steel and killed engines. Perfect conditions for the next step in the experiment. Morozov looked toward the huge factory doors, now half frozen open. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" Koshkin nodded once. Without another word, the two men climbed down and walked toward the exit, their boots echoing across the cavernous hall. The prototype still sat silent behind them, incomplete, untested, but fierce in profile. Tomorrow, before dawn, they would try something no Soviet tank design bureau had ever dared attempt in winter. A field trial, in the snow, with a nearly unproven engine. If it worked, the T-34 would move one step closer to survival. If it didn't, well. In 1939, failures didn't just end careers, they ended people. And in that freezing moment, as the factory lights flickered under the strain, a single question followed them out into the night. Would the prototype endure the cold or die in it? By the spring of 1941, the prototype's scars had been patched, its steel plates resurfaced, and its engine tuned once more. Yet something had changed, subtly, profoundly. It was no longer a prototype struggling to justify its existence. It felt like a machine waiting for a war it seemed to sense was coming. At KHPZ, the mood had shifted from skepticism to urgency. Rumors swept across drafting tables and assembly floors, German divisions massing in Poland, reconnaissance flights brushing the border, Soviet generals quietly requesting performance reports on every tank in production. Koshkin wasn't around to see what came next, but his tank was. Rows of newly completed T-34 Model 1940s stood in muddy factory yards, their sloped armor catching early morning frost, looking strangely predatory even at rest. Workers who once mocked the design now touched its steel like it was something sacred, whispering that the mad engineer had seen something none of them did. Across the border, German crews were briefing their commanders with total confidence. Panzer III, Panzer IV, proven, reliable. Their guns were expected to tear through any Soviet armor they encountered. And why wouldn't they believe that? They had spent 2 years rolling across Europe with near-total impunity. But deep inside Soviet rail convoys covered with tarps and guarded by NKVD squads, a new shape was moving west. A shape the Wehrmacht had never seen. A shape that would soon haunt them. On the eve of June 22nd, an engineer at the Kharkov factory wrote in his diary, "We do not know what tomorrow brings. But if war comes, I would not want to be in a German tank." Hours later, as the sun rose over the western frontier, the sky erupted. The war Koshkin built his machine for had arrived. And the Germans were about to learn that their greatest advantage, their armored spearheads, were suddenly, shockingly obsolete. By the spring of 1940, the prototype that Koshkin had nearly given his life for had become something almost mythical inside the Kharkiv Design Bureau. Engineers whispered about it. Factory foremen argued about it. Soldiers who saw it during trials swore they had never witnessed a machine move like that in deep snow. Yet officially, it still didn't exist. The bureaucracy in Moscow stalled, shuffled papers, demanded revisions that contradicted each other. Some commissars insisted the armor be increased without adding weight. Others wanted a gasoline engine for standardization. A few still argued that sloped armor was unnecessary, a designer's vanity. In the Kharkiv factory, the workers, the welders, the machinists, the young apprentices who shaped steel plates by hand knew what they were building. They felt it every time they stood beside the prototype on the shop floor. It looked like nothing else. It felt alive. And with Koshkin gone, the responsibility now rested on the shoulders of his deputy, Alexander Morozov. He walked the factory floor daily, boots ringing on concrete, clipboard under his arm, face set with quiet determination. He didn't speak like Koshkin, didn't inspire men with rousing speeches or defiant challenges. But when he laid a hand on the tank's armor, that sloped, radical hull, his eyes hardened with the same belief. Koshkin was right. The Red Army needed this. Still, Moscow hesitated. Meetings dragged on, officers debated statistics, committees argued over production capacity. They asked impossible questions. How can we build this machine in the thousands? What if it proves too advanced for mass manufacturing? What if the armor cracks under extreme cold? What if Germany never attacks at all? And then everything changed. On June 22, 1941, the sky over the western Soviet frontier filled with the roar of engines, thousands of aircraft, hundreds of tank divisions. The ground shook as the Wehrmacht stormed across the border. Reports flooded eastward like a tsunami, cities burning, garrisons overrun. Units wiped out in hours. The unthinkable had begun. The Soviet Union suddenly needed every tank it could get. They needed armor that could survive artillery, avoid bogging in mud, and keep fighting even with inexperienced crews. For years, committees debated theoretical wars. Now the real one had arrived, and buried in a stack of ignored design proposals, stamped and forgotten, was Koshkin's final request: immediate full-scale production of the T-34. Morozov stood in the dim hallway outside the factory office as the news hit. He didn't celebrate. He didn't speak. He simply walked back to the shop floor. Then he said the words every worker had been waiting to hear. "Start assembling them, all of them. We begin today." But none of them, not even Morozov, were prepared for what would happen just a few weeks later when the first T-34s rolled into combat, when German gun crews would fire at it and watch their shells bounce off. June 25, 1941, 6 days into Operation Barbarossa. The fields outside Grodno are burning, dotted with the wreckage of Soviet border units that never had a chance. German Panzer III and Panzer IV crews roll forward confidently, believing with reason that nothing the Red Army fields can stop them. Then they see it. A shape moving through the smoke, not fast, not slow, just unstoppable. At first, Oberleutnant Hans Rudel thinks it's a trick of the light, a tank with a strangely angled hull, almost like the entire machine is leaning forward. He blinks hard, it's still coming. The thing shrugs off small caliber impacts like rain on a stone roof. The first shells hit its turret with bright sparks clang, clang, glancing off as if the rounds were fired from toy guns. The German gunners stare, confused. That isn't how armor plates behave. Armor should dent, deform, tear open. But this thing, it feels like shooting at a sliding wall. Rudel's loader slams in an armor-piercing shell. The gunner fires again, another deflection. Inside the German tank, the crew exchanges glances, nervous, silent, because they know what they're seeing doesn't match anything in their manuals, their intelligence briefings, or their training. This is something new. And then, through the drifting smoke, they notice something else, the tracks. Wide, almost absurdly wide. Wide enough to float over the marshy earth the German tanks are already sinking into. The Soviet machine swings its turret with surprising smoothness, faster than a Panzer III, faster than expected from a heavy, crude Eastern design. The long 76 barrel locks onto Rudel's tank. For the first time in the invasion, he feels a cold spike of fear. This enemy, whatever it is hunting them. The Soviet gun flashes. The round punches clean through the German armor plate and exits the far side in a cone of sparks, leaving the Panzer crippled and hissing steam. Rudel shouts for the crew to bail out, but the hatch jams from the blast deformation. Outside, more of the strange, sloped armor tanks appear, emerging like giants from the tree line, their engines rumbling with the deeper note of diesel instead of the high whine of gasoline motors. Rudel realizes something horrifying. The Soviets have a tank better than anything Germany has brought to the battlefield. And then another realization chills him even more, a doctrinal one. If the Soviets can mass-produce these, if they can field not dozens but hundreds, the entire German blitzkrieg assumption collapses. He's still staring at the approaching silhouette, perfectly angled, perfectly indifferent to gunfire, when Soviet infantry begin advancing behind it, rifles raised, cheering. The unstoppable shape closes in. Rudel has seconds, maybe less. He reaches again for the jammed hatch. It doesn't budge. This is how quickly the balance can shift, he thinks. And on that burning Belarusian field, the myth of German armored invincibility takes its first hammer blow. Dawn broke over the smoking plains west of Bryansk, turning the lingering gunpowder haze into a streaked, ghostly orange. The battlefield looked like an industrial graveyard, burned-out trucks, twisted artillery pieces, and the scattered silhouettes of Panzer III turrets blown clean off their mounts. But the strangest shapes of all were the hulking shadows that still sat upright in the fields, armor pitted and scarred, but largely intact. T-34s, dozens of them. Captain Heinrich Müller of the 10th Panzer Division walked silently among them, his boots crunching over frost-coated earth. The cold had stiffened the corpses of fallen soldiers, both German and Soviet, and yet somehow the tanks felt more alive than the men who fought around them. Their sloped plates were beaded with frozen dew, shaped like predatory animals waiting to spring. Müller stopped at one wreck, if you could even call it a wreck, 3 direct hits, 2 from 15 guns, 1 from an anti-tank rifle. None had penetrated. He pressed his glove against the impact crater. It was shallow, barely a dent. "This isn't possible," he muttered. His lieutenant approached, breath fogging in the air. "Sir, General Guderian's staff car just arrived. He wants reports from frontline officers." Müller didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the tank before him, its turret slightly tilted, tracks frozen in mud as if the machine itself was mocking them. "How do you fight something that ignores the rules?" he whispered. Behind him, a medic team struggled to free a wounded German driver trapped under a flipped Panzer III turret. The contrast was brutal, impossible to ignore. German machines shattered like toys while the T-34s stood like iron monuments to a new era. Within hours, Guderian himself stood beside the same tank, steam rising from his breath, frustration tightening his jaw. Officers gathered around him, exchanging anxious glances. Their reconnaissance notes were damning. Sloped armor effectively doubled its protection. Its diesel engine refused to burn like their gasoline models. Its wide tracks turned mud into an ally rather than an enemy. And its gun, the 76.2, punched through their armor like paper. "This is a revolution," one major admitted. A complete revolution in tank design. Guderian didn't answer immediately. He walked around the tank, his hand trailing across the wounded steel as though studying a predator he had never encountered before. Finally, he spoke almost to himself. If the Soviets can build these in numbers, his voice trailed off. Everyone knew the implication, and nobody wanted to say it aloud. At midday, a cold wind swept across the field, rattling loose metal and carrying with it the low rumble of engines in the distance. German soldiers instinctively turned toward the sound, half expecting another wave of these unstoppable beasts to appear over the horizon. Fear, real fear. You could feel it tighten the air. Hours later, at division headquarters, frantic radio messages crackled through the static, reports from other sectors confirming the same thing. T-34s smashing through anti-tank lines, columns of German armor forced to retreat, artillery crews abandoning positions because their shells simply weren't working. By nightfall, orders swept through the German command. Capture a T-34 intact. Study it, copy it. Understand how such a thing existed, how such a primitive nation had produced a machine that broke all their assumptions. But the truth was far more unsettling. This machine wasn't an accident. It wasn't a fluke of Soviet industry. It was the result of one man, an engineer who had defied orders, expectations, and even the threat of execution because he believed tanks needed to change. And he had been right. As a freezing rain began to fall over the front line that night, dripping off the armor plates like tears, one question hung over every German commander. If this is only the beginning, what else have we underestimated? A question that would soon be answered by events even more shocking. The prototype convoy rolled westward under a bruised dawn sky, engines rumbling through the half-frozen mud roads of Belarus. Mechanics hung off the sides of support trucks, their overcoats stiff with frost. At the head of the column, two T-34 prototypes pushed forward like angular beasts waking from hibernation, their armor plates still unpainted, their edges raw from the welding torch. Koshkin rode inside the lead tank, coughing into his scarf, the fever in his lungs worsening by the hour. But he refused to look weak. Every jolt of the suspension rattled his ribs, yet he kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, listening to the rhythmic thrum of the V2 diesel as if it were a heartbeat he had personally engineered. Beside him, test driver Vasily Kupryanov kept one hand on the steel wheel, the other wiping condensation from the periscope glass. "She handles like a bull," he muttered, grinning despite the cold. "But a bull that listens." Koshkin managed a thin smile. "That's the point." Outside, sleet began to fall, thin needles of ice that hissed against the turret. The convoy slowed. Visibility dropped to a few meters. A lesser tank might have bogged down within minutes. The T-34 continued forward as if the road didn't matter at all. Behind them, bureau officials huddled inside heated trucks, arguing about production figures, supply chains, factory retooling. But all their calculations meant nothing without proof. That was why this punishing cross-country trial mattered, not just to Koshkin's legacy, but to the future of Soviet armor itself. As the landscape rolled by, soldiers stationed along the route stopped what they were doing to stare. Some pointed. Others shook their heads. This wasn't a BT-7. This wasn't a T-26. This was something different, something new. By the time the convoy reached Kiev, crowds had gathered on the roadsides. Children ran beside the tracks until they tired, trying to touch the armored skirts. Old veterans from the Civil War stood silently, eyes tracing the slope of the glacis plate, understanding exactly what such angles meant. The prototypes continued another 100 kilometers before the first breakdown. A minor fuel line clog cleared in 20 minutes. But the news that a tank had crossed half the Soviet Union without bogging down, overheating, or snapping a suspension arm spread quickly through the political channels. It reached Moscow, and with it came a summons. Koshkin knew what that meant, a demonstration, a final test before the design lived or died. He pressed a hand against the cold steel interior, breathing shallowly. "She'll convince them," he whispered to himself. "She has to." But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that Germany's invasion timetable had already been drafted. The Wehrmacht was coming, and soon the T-34 wouldn't need to impress bureaucrats, it would need to survive. March 19, 1940, outskirts of Kharkov. The dawn is pale, brittle, and merciless. A frozen wind cuts across the steppe, whipping snow into jagged, drifting waves. Roads are buried under ice, ruts filled with frozen water, the kind of terrain that would immobilize every conventional tank the Red Army possesses. And yet through this white hell, the 34 rumbles forward. Its wide tracks chew the ice like knives through bread. The sloped armor glints faintly, catching the first rays of sunlight on its angled plates. Inside, the crew is hunched, frozen, but focused. Levers are cranked, dials are red, every engine roar echoing in the steel hull. Outside, Koshkin runs beside it again, not out of necessity, but to feel the machine under his hands, to push it, to coax it through drifts that should have stopped a lesser tank in its tracks. Observers in heavy coats and furs cluster at the edges of the proving ground. Engineers scribble notes, military officers mutter their doubts, and political functionaries frown. "See that?" one officer asks, pointing at a snow-filled rut. "No tank could survive that." The 34 does, tracks bite through. Suspension flexes, diesel engine roars, snow sprays like artillery fire from its treads, steam hisses from exhaust vents. The tank doesn't stagger, it doesn't stall, it moves like a predator over the frozen landscape. Koshkin smiles, bloodless lips cracking in the cold. For the first time, he allows himself to imagine the possibilities. A tank that can move when others cannot. Armor that can shrug off hits that would destroy ordinary vehicles. A design so radical, so simple, yet so effective that it might just change everything. And then the demonstration takes a new turn. A frozen pond stretches ahead, deceptively smooth. Observers hold their breath. They expect the tank to slip, to slide, to sink. The 34 climbs onto the ice, tracks grip, steel bites. The tank glides across the pond, leaving nothing but shallow furrows in its wake. Murmurs ripple through the crowd. Shock, disbelief, whispered admiration. One young engineer can barely contain himself. It works. It actually works." A political officer, face tight with skepticism, whispers something into his companion's ear. "This is madness. How can this be real?" But Koshkin knows the truth. He has felt it in the engine's growl, in the resistance of the tracks, in the armor's imperviousness to the test rounds they had fired the day before. This machine, born of ridicule, will survive the Winter War, and one day it will survive far worse. The test is nearly over. The 34 halts at the far edge of the proving ground. Steam and snow swirl around its angular hull. Observers are frozen in awe. Even the harshest skeptics cannot deny it. Koshkin approaches, gloved hands tracing a frost-covered fender. "Tomorrow," he mutters to himself, "they will see it in combat." He does not yet know that when the Wehrmacht invades in 1941, German tank crews, blinded by arrogance, trained to expect fragile Soviet armor, will confront the very thing he has just coaxed across this frozen steppe. And they will recoil. Because the T-34 is no longer just a tank. It is a revelation. June 22, 1941, borderlands of the Soviet Union. The morning sun barely penetrates the haze of smoke and dust rising from scorched fields. Birds flee the trees, alarmed by distant explosions. The Wehrmacht has launched Operation Barbarossa, and the horizon is a river of fire and steel. German panzer units roar across the plains, confident in their superiority. Their commanders, trained, meticulous, armored in arrogance, expect to face outdated Soviet tanks, the BT-7s and T-26s they had mocked in intelligence reports, machines that would bend and shatter under Krupp steel. But suddenly, something moves differently. Shadow, a form, a tank that seems too solid, too fast, too impossible. The first T-34s emerge from tree lines and across frozen fields, their wide tracks carving paths where none should exist, their sloped armor glinting ominously under the early sun. Dust rises around them, a metallic wind carrying the scent of oil, snow melt, and determination. A German commander squints through his binoculars. "What is that?" A shell strikes a T-34's glacis plate. It bounces off, ricochets. The tank barely shudders. Crew inside barely flinch. Another round hits the turret, slides off again. Confusion spreads through the German ranks. They aim again. Miss, aim again. Miss T-34's advance, diesel engines growling, wider tracks crushing soft ground effortlessly. Mobility, firepower, and armor combine in a way they have never seen. The battlefield is no longer theirs to dominate. Inside a T-34, the Soviet crew moves with practiced precision. The commander barks orders, gunner fires, loader reloads. Cold sweat drips, but the machine hums, obedient and deadly. German officers realize too late that what they dismissed as a toy tank is a weapon born of brilliance, perseverance, and defiance of doubt. Chaos erupts. Units meant to advance smoothly falter, stumble, retreat. Panzer IVs are stopped by something they cannot pierce. Medium tanks, fast but lightly armored, are shredded by the sloped hulls of these new Soviet machines. Somewhere in the distance, a young German soldier mutters in disbelief, almost to himself. They cannot be stopped." Koshkin is far away, back in the workshops, yet in that instant his vision takes shape on the battlefield. Every ridged track, every angled plate, every roaring diesel engine validates the sleepless nights, the bureaucratic ridicule, and the long hours spent arguing in dimly lit design rooms. The T-34 is no longer theoretical. It is real. It is lethal. And it is nearly impossible to defeat. This is the moment when the world realizes that tank warfare has changed forever. But the battle is just beginning. The Germans will regroup. They will learn. They will adapt. And yet the T-34 will always be a step ahead. July 1941, Eastern Front, somewhere near Smolensk. The smoke of battle still hangs in the air, a dense, gray curtain above the pockmarked earth. Craters filled with water reflect twisted fragments of steel and shattered trees. The screams of artillery fade into the distant rumble of tanks rolling across the plains. And in the middle of it all, the T-34 moves with uncanny precision. German crews, once confident and mocking, now squint through sights, trying to find a weak spot. The sloped armor glints in the sunlight, throwing rounds aside like a shield against both doubt and bullets. Wide tracks glide over ruined roads, marshy fields, and broken earth with ease. Diesel engines roar, carrying Soviet crews forward without hesitation. Reports stream back to Berlin. Panzer divisions are losing ground. Numbers don't matter when the T-34 can shrug off repeated hits. Tactical planning falters against sheer, unexpected resilience. Inside the tank, the crew is tense but alive, hearts pounding. They know this machine will save them when lighter armor would have failed. Each shell that bounces off is a confirmation of Koshkin's vision, proof that ingenuity and courage can defy convention. Back in Moscow, engineers gather to review field reports. The room, once filled with whispers of ridicule, now hums with cautious respect. Photographs of destroyed German tanks litter the table, alongside diagrams of the T-34. Even the party officers, once skeptical of sloped armor and wide tracks, nod in begrudging approval. One engineer whispers to another, "He did it. He really did it." The T-34's reputation spreads like wildfire. Stories of its resilience reach every corner of the Soviet Union. Soldiers begin to call it the unbreakable tank. Factories ramp up production, churning out units at an unprecedented pace. Every design choice that was once mocked, sloped armor, diesel engine, wide tracks, becomes a blueprint for the future of armored warfare. German commanders in their briefings finally acknowledge the truth. Intelligence officers circulate reports warning of the T-34's capabilities. Even seasoned tank crews speak in hushed tones, almost afraid to say it aloud. This is a machine that could not be underestimated. Koshkin, back at the design bureau, watches photographs of the battlefield and allows himself a rare smile. His ridiculous idea, the one that had drawn laughter and doubt, is now changing the course of history. From skepticism to shock, from mockery to reverence, the T-34 has proven its worth. And though battles will continue and enemies will adapt, one truth remains. A single engineer's vision, defended through storms, ridicule, and bureaucracy, created a tank that was nearly impossible to stop. The world of armored warfare will never be the same again.